Hi, this is Fraser Cameron, the Director of the EU Asia Centre, and welcome to this webinar on China's global role after COVID-19. We're pleased today not only to have attendees from the Brussels bubble, but from all over the world, from Japan to New Zealand to the United States, so welcome everybody. Before I introduce our two panelists, just a couple of rules. Each will open with a short statement, then I will pose a couple of questions based on what some of you have already sent in, and then we will open it up to further questions, which you can either type in or you can put up your hand in the hand box, and we will try also by audio. So we have 60 minutes, so please keep any comments and questions quite brief and to the point. So to our two panelists today, first, Reinhard Bütikofer is a German MEP and chair of the European Parliament's Delegation for Relations with China. He's a prolific user of social media, and unlike most politicians, writes in a very concise, clear, very interesting and quite funny manner, so he's well worth following. Professor Kerry Brown is a well-known expert in China. He's the director of the Lau Institute at King's College in London and has had several previous academic postings and author, as I say, of many books and articles. Kerry will kick us off, and then we will pass over to Reinhard, and then we're going to open it up. So thank you both for joining us, gentlemen. Kerry, you have the floor.
Great, well, thank you very much. So I hope you can hear me clearly. It's good that I've been invited to this, so I'm very grateful. And it's good to see my old friend Reinhard doing well in Germany. So I think I'll speak for 10 minutes. So there is a problem with China. There has been a problem with China for a long time, and the problem has changed over the years. But now the problem, I think, is a particularly intense one. The problems before were about the fact that China had a particular political model, a particular approach to global economics, the fact that in entering the World Trade Organization 20 years ago, it's then been associated with destroying workers' jobs in America, being a problem in kind of trading in the European Union, and also in a whole host of other areas. As its economic size has grown, it has become a problem on many, many different kinds of fronts. So in the midst of this context, COVID-19 occurs, and this problem, certainly the first fatalities originated in China. There's been a great controversy between particularly America and China over where it originated, but it seems the consensus is that this particular generation of this virus originated somehow in China, and now has spread globally. And the largest number of fatalities are now outside of China, in particular in the United States. So the symbolism of this, of course, is highly problematic. Here is a major public health issue. Public health everywhere is, of course, enormously contentious. That is now reaching deep into the lives of America, Europe, Australia. And when you think of the underlying political context, this is really kind of intensifying boundaries and creating a sort of new dimension, a new level of problematization, which was already very well established. So I suppose really looking at this, we have to kind of work out, what is this, where are we going and what does this mean? Are we heading towards a world in which China, as of today, looks pretty isolated? I mean, it already was quite isolated because of its very unique political model, but now it seems that there's China versus the world. The second question is, well, is that a good thing? A fifth of humanity under a system where everyone is kind of pretty alienated towards China, issues within China. We don't really know exactly what the political impact of COVID-19 has been in China. I mean, under Xi Jinping, everything seems all calm and placid, but maybe we're misunderstanding. We don't understand the dynamics of what's happening within China. And then on top of this, the kind of issue of where does Europe lie between the United States and China? Very different kind of issues for Europe, not just those that relate to America. In terms of security and economics, our lives have obviously become much, much more difficult. Within Europe, we have our own kind of political issues, Brexit, inequality, all of the kind of issues of globalization, the problems that Italy is experiencing at the moment, and COVID-19 has certainly complicated that in ways which is really, really hard to predict. I suppose what I could really do, though, in a few minutes is just say, well, what is undesirable? And I'm sort of trying to stand really in a kind of neutral space. A world in which the United States and China are perpetually almost at war, not physically at war, but kind of a trade war, geopolitical war, really struggling against each other, is an uncomfortable place. We know that because we've kind of been experiencing it a little bit in the last 3 years. And really in this kind of context, what I suppose we're seeing is the trade war between the US and China being a prelude to something much, much nastier and much sharper and much bigger. And are we moving into that? That, I think, would be a very, very, very problematic period. It's not like the Cold War, where the USSR could almost de-link from America because it didn't really have many big economic contacts. China is interlinked into supply chains, into the world's economy, in ways which they can probably be decoupled in a long, long time, but not very quickly. I mean, that may be what America wants, but it's not going to happen overnight. And just look at the case of Apple and its newest iPhone and how most of that will have to be manufactured in China because the supply chain is so well established there, though by the Taiwanese company Foxconn. So this is not going to be an easy decoupling to do. And the perpetual tension that we live with gives a level of uncertainty on top of issues like climate change, issues like future pandemics, which we really could live without. So I suppose the second option is that we have a sort of managed decoupling, a managed kind of division of the world. This would not be appeasement. I think this would just be pragmatic acceptance, where you have a kind of area which you say we can work together, and public health is going to be one of those areas in which environmental issues we do work together and can continue, and other areas where we're just going to have to accept that we are profoundly different. This is obviously deeply politically unattractive to certain constituencies in the United States. It is deeply unattractive to many in Europe. But the question is not whether it's attractive, it's whether it is at least the pragmatic option when all the others are not so great, when all the others are so unattractive. So this is really a kind of, I suppose, in living in this era, we are living in an era of harsh realism and pragmatism. And the question is, are we able to view this issue pragmatically? China's not going to go away. Despite this issue, its political model is unlikely to change anytime soon. It may be desirable for it to change, for sure. It may be that it will change one day. But I think we have to just admit, after 30 years of engagement with China and hoping, particularly as Europeans, that it would adopt the desirable values and the political kind of ideas and functions of Europe, that it's really not likely to at the moment. And under Xi Jinping, we have no evidence that it's going to. We have to accept that we are going to be working with a partner in certain areas that does things which are deeply, deeply worrying. What China's just done in Hong Kong, for instance, or what has happened in Hong Kong is quite extraordinary. What China is doing towards Taiwan is also problematic. What China does in Xinjiang is deeply problematic. I recognize all of that. However, we have to be pragmatic and try and think of ways in which we prioritize the things that matter to us. We accept that we can change some of the things that China does in ways which we probably didn't before, but we also have to recognize that the worst possible outcome is a world in which the United States and China are perpetually at each other's throats, in which there is a political divide, a rushed decoupling, which creates all sorts of economic uncertainty, and then finally a kind of, almost like a perpetual, not a Cold War, because I think a Cold War had a neatness and simplicity, and you could see in the end a kind of winner out of it, but a world in which we just sort of accept this is not a war, that it is kind of perpetually competitive, there's always going to be strategic issues, but we can't really go for a kind of outcome in which one walks away as the complete winner. So that is not a particularly straightforward world. It is a world in which people like me have to explain an awful lot and take a lot of criticism, of course. It is a world in which politicians like Reinhard have to really also take a position and try and work out a pragmatic way forward. But it has to be a world that works, because either we live in that kind of world or a world which is falling apart. And although that's obviously a possibility now, it is not something that anyone would want. And we have to avoid that world by working with China, whether we like it or not. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kerry. That's certainly a lot of food for thought. Reinhard, what's your view?
Thanks, Fraser, first of all, for organizing this, and thank you, Professor Brown, for your contribution and your willingness to share this platform. Let me start with two initial remarks. I'm not going to be neutral. And of course, it's always hard to make predictions when they pertain to the future, because what we do might have an impact, if we're lucky, on what will emanate. So I would start by saying that I believe that the nature of China's internal development and the nature of China's relation with the world has changed since Xi Jinping took over. So I would argue that Xi Jinping's coming to power amounts effectively to a kind of inner Chinese regime change, when what could have been called a communist aristocracy was turned into a party emperor system. That shows on different fronts. It shows internally in China, but also in the relationship with the world. Xi Jinping's China clearly has hegemonic ambitions. When he says time and again in his speeches that China wants to move to the center of the international relations, that's another expression for that. And I think we probably both agree that the convergence theory that the West broadly pursued over the last more than 20 years, including when we allowed China into the WTO, is not an adequate description of what we see before us now. China cannot be criticized for trying to play an important role as a big nation, but the fact that it is an autocratic, or I would even say a totalitarian system internally, of course also is being reflected in its relationship to the world. So China's hegemonic ambition includes making the world a safer place for autocracy. And the nature of the party state is such, and I think that China has been successful recently over the last few years in making headway in that regard. One in some multilateral institutions, and that's partly due to the idiotic policy of the US administration that gave up playing a leadership role that used to be the part of the US contribution to international relations. So for instance, of the 15 special organizations that the UN has, 4 have a Chinese president and 7 have a Chinese vice president. No other nation is even close to that level of influence. But China has also been successful in building new China-centric structures, in particular the Belt and Road, which is the opposite of multilateralism. It's serial bilateralism, or hub and spokes. And this has been the case before Corona, but now in the new situation, I would argue that a perceived and probably really existing internal weakness has been transformed into a more aggressive attitude in international relations. So we see the new phenomenon of the wolf warrior diplomats, namely spokesperson Zhao and some ambassadors around Europe. And I think this has begun backfiring. The Chinese have been shooting themselves in the foot. And I just want to quote Tom Tugendhat, the chair of the House of Commons Select Committee on Foreign Relations, who said, and I don't quote him precisely, it's not possible to keep importing cheap Chinese goods without also importing autocracy or totalitarianism and all the implications which that has. China increasingly behaves not as a partner, but as a dominating force that allows only vassals. So, for instance, when you look at the health issue, the face mask diplomacy issue, China told the Europeans, look, don't talk about your help to us because we would be losing face. And when they returned the favor and transported some material to different European countries, they told the recipients, do say thank you and say it loudly. That's the attitude of a dominant power to a vassal. I believe that this has not been a successful approach, and I hear also some voices within China that are criticizing that are warning against this approach. But I think we have to, and there I agree with what Professor Brown said, we cannot wish China away, and we cannot wish that China would be other than it is. So we have to deal with that. And I think we have to deal with that in different dimensions. On trade, we have already started within the European Union to find some new approaches, anti-dumping measures, investment screening. We're now talking about the international procurement instruments. We're talking about anti-subsidy policies on reshoring. I believe Europe will be partially, at least, going in the same direction as the Japanese and the Australians, not to talk of America, with sort of, as Jörg Wuttke, the president of the European Chamber of Commerce in Beijing put it, putting the eggs into different baskets, and not all of them, or not too many of them, into the Chinese basket. And we will have to deal with BRI and our own connectivity policy, with CivMil fusion in China, which has hardly been noticed around Europe in political circles, with 5G and all that. But that it's not exclusively an economic issue. And I'm not saying we should push back as much as we can. I don't subscribe to the American approach that is just 180 degrees opposite of what it was since President Nixon first visited China in the 70s. It used to be, well, we want to make China, as Bob Zoellick would have said, a responsible stakeholder, and we will push back wherever necessary. Today, the attitude in the United States, and that is a bipartisan consensus, as far as I know, is we will push back wherever possible, and we will cooperate only where absolutely necessary. That's not my approach. That cannot be a European approach. We should try to cooperate with China wherever it is possible, but we should be much more realistic about the scope of that sentence. We have to cooperate with a much more hard-nosed approach, defending our values and our interests much better and much more united than we have. But it's also, of course, about other dimensions. And I would want to pick up what you said, Professor Brown, about Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and other issues. There, I would expect that in the immediate future and over the next years, China would be more aggressive against Taiwan, in Xinjiang and Tibet, and so on. And I see that the empire that Xi is building is partly coming apart at the seams. And as he knows only one approach, which is much more limited in scope than the approach that his predecessors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, pursued, namely bearing down on opposition, I think he will be confronted with much more complex and much more aggravating confrontations in all these fields. And I think that we should not expect China to be willing to compromise over that, which means what is our attitude? And my attitude, and it's hard to say that in very specific terms, but my attitude would be that we should be clear, we should be stubborn and stoic, but not escalating. As regards the international dimensions, I would just want to mention one more, which is what Josep Borrell, the HRVP, called the battle of narratives. For a while, we had this battle of narratives when we pursued actively the human rights issues. That has died down. There has been a piece of research by different European China-related research think tanks that came to the conclusion, I think that was the year before last, that basically, apart from the European Parliament, hardly anybody in Europe really talks about human rights with regard to China anymore in the political theater. Maybe Tusk, maybe Merkel, maybe the British, but that's about it. And I think we are now seeing that the Chinese are taking the battle to us. They're not content anymore, and this is a change also in their approach. I can only recall an early phase of the Cultural Revolution when China was so proactively promoting its own model as an international model to be followed by others. So that's a new approach, and I think we have to get involved very much into this battle of narratives. And that, of course, presupposes that Europe would stay together and be united on that, which is not yet the case. But I believe we're in this for a long term.
Okay, thank you very much, Reinhard. I think there's a fair amount of convergence in some of your views, but there's one or two points of differences here which we can pick up. There's a question coming in, I'll put it straight to Kerry. This is the first time that the Chinese economy is going to contract, and by amazing 6.8% in the first quarter this year. What do you think will be the implications of that, both for the economy and politically in China, Kerry?
Yeah, I mean, so Reinhard's right. Reinhard's right about the battle of narratives. And one of the narratives is about prosperity and economic development. And in a curious way, Europe, America, and China are going to be aligned on this, whether they like it or not, because obviously COVID-19 is ripping our economies apart. And we don't know where this is going to lead, but it's obviously not going to lead to a very happy place. So I guess it's going to be partly who gets out of this most sort of effectively. Now, in SARS 20 years ago, China had a similar kind of dip. It wasn't so dramatic, but a dip. And then, you know, after a kind of quarter, it then bounced out of that. This time, the dip is really savage. I think it's 6%. I mean, China's never really known that kind of figure before. So if it is the case that China somehow manages to restore growth and does it kind of quickly, whereas in America and Europe, we are completely hit. So Europe's had pretty flat growth for a number of years. America has been much, much better, but is going through a terrible time. So, you know, that kind of that part of the narrative is going to be really important, because whether we like it or not, it's going to be an enormous sort of propaganda asset for China. It can say, look, our system is able to basically stand up after this massive hit and, you know, kind of continue, at least relatively unscathed. Now, we don't know that now. It may well be all of us get very, very badly hit, but I mean, it is going to be a competition. In any case, you know, the kind of the news at the moment seems to be that in China, supply chains are being restored and kind of, you know, Foxconn, as I said earlier, is able to start manufacturing parts for the new iPhone later in the year. The real question is, of course, that once Europe comes, hopefully as soon as possible, out of lockdown, it will be, you know, how is it going to address these very urgent issues, and the same for America. That's when I think we go from the public health issue with all of its very, very complicated problems to the economics issue. And I think that this whole problem is going to be sorted out in the economic realm eventually, and then it's going to gravitate to the geopolitical realm. Thanks.
Let me see if Kerry agrees with that, because another question says, after the financial crisis, China became the locomotive, helping both Europe and the United States to recover. It may not be able to play the same role this time, but the economies are much more interdependent now than they were just 10 years ago. So is the talk of decoupling not an illusion, Reinhard?
Well, I would tend to agree with Professor Brown that the fantasy of total decoupling is indeed an illusion. But I would want to point out that even though the word decoupling was invented in the Beltway, the practice of this decoupling was invented in Beijing. Beijing started decoupling when they didn't allow Facebook, Google, and many other technology firms when they closed their markets to some of our European companies. Beijing pursues a strategy of decoupling when they point out in the context of their Made in China 2025 strategy, which is a very nationalistic economic concept, what their ambition is. I think our reaction would have to be that we should decouple segmentally or partially in a focused way where not decoupling would infringe upon our security. Decoupling, from my point of view, is should not be employed as an economic concept, but as a security-based concept. So where not decoupling infringes on security and public order, we should think about decoupling. So for instance, 5G, there we should decouple. That's not across the board. As regards the question of economic strength, nobody knows whether China will be coping successfully, but I would dare to remind everybody that China needs much more growth than we need in Europe to keep their society stable. Clearly below 6% growth has a terrible impact on a highly divided, very unbalanced, very socially divided economy and society. And it will be very hard for them to be successful with, and they will be boasting of 2% growth or whatever, 1.5%. And even if they had 4, it would be worse than if we had just 1.
There's another question here about what you called the wolf warrior diplomacy, Reinhard. Is this not essentially aimed, and it's linked to the last question, to shore up domestic support for Xi Jinping, the fact that this more aggressive diplomacy is underway?
I agree with that. That's how I see that. But of course, they are ruining a lot of China. I mean, they're the elephant in the China shop by approaching it like that. They don't give a damn. There was a very interesting article, I think it was last week in Global Times, that praised the wolf warrior diplomats. And this is now showing the strength of China. I mean, the Global Times is the central organ of all the Chinese chauvinists, but it is also for domestic consumption, but it's also shaping China's and impacting China's relation to the world, and we cannot take that lightly. I just saw advertisement for a new book on China's diplomacy vis-a-vis Russia, and there was a quote from the late 18th century when the imperial court in China insulted the Russian imperial court by talking down to them. And so the wolf warriors are reviving that kind of approach to the world. And I think we have to push back.
Okay, there's another question here from Japan in terms of how to best defend the multilateral system. I mean, we've seen some examples of this, partly in response, of course, to the United States and the WTO, with 16 countries setting up a provisional system in the WTO. But looking to what you said earlier, Reinhard, about China's growing dominance of certain international organizations, how should the EU react to this? How can we build like-minded coalitions to deal and strengthen multilateralism?
Two partial answers. One, in a conversation, a panel discussion I attended recently, a professor from South Africa got very impatient with all the Europeans that proclaimed multilateralism and said, look, for us in the South, multilateralism in the past was never a very good offer. So if you are just nostalgic about what used to be multilateralism, that's not interesting for us. And I think that's a very valid point. Multilateralism has to be reshaped, including countries from the South as active partners and not just destinaries of our policy. And second, there are examples where we are showing that we learn how to deal with that. So for instance, connectivity policy. Last September, Prime Minister Abe and Commission President Juncker signed a memorandum of understanding between Japan and the EU about cooperation in infrastructure development policies. I think if we could make that happen, and if we could include the US Blue Dot Network initiative also, and the efforts of the Australians, for instance, this would be a very good example of actually relevant multilateralism. When you preach to developing countries the gospel of multilateralism, they ask, what is in it for us? I recall a conversation with the finance minister of Indonesia when she was asked about what she felt, how she looked at the Belt and Road Initiative. She said, give me an alternative and I will tell you what I think of it. I think this is what we have to deal with. Multilateralism has to be reinvented if we want to make it survive. But, and let me add this, if we insist on multilateralism and make it work, then we could possibly rein in the danger that Professor Brown spoke about, that the two big elephants, the two big superpowers, China and the US, would trot everything else, would trot on all the other grass. If we can uphold multilateralism as a functioning system with partners worldwide, we can rein in that danger.
Okay, thank you, Reinhard. Kerry, there's a question here from Jim Moran, who was former EU ambassador, in terms of whether Taiwan's success has had any effect on mainland public opinion, and more generally, you know, how is public opinion perceiving how the government has reacted to the crisis?
Yeah, so Taiwan has had, I think, 6 or 7 fatalities. It has not had a sort of very, very complete lockdown. I mean, people wear masks, but it's Tsai Ing-wen, I think she was in Time magazine recently talking about how they've managed it. You would say at the moment that they are one of the most successful at combating this virus. And that raises all sorts of interesting questions, you know, why and how. They are not a member of the World Health Organization. I mean, that's been very, very controversial. They were, I think, observers at the World Health Assembly until recently. And yet they have been effective at dealing with the challenges of this issue, despite being very, very economically interlinked, you know, with China. Taiwan is obviously a strategic priority for the People's Republic. It wants reunification, and Xi Jinping has spoken about this consistently. But I think it also is a wonderful kind of topic to think about the contradictions of China's what it wants and how it's going about trying to get it, and how in many ways its biggest problem is itself. Everything that has happened in Hong Kong under the one country, two systems framework in the last few years has been deeply unappealing to people in Taiwan. And you have seen a real kind of decline of people identifying now as Chinese. I mean, it's now, people maybe say they're Taiwanese Chinese, but most people in surveys say they're Taiwanese. Tsai Ing-wen was enjoying pretty bad polls about a year and a half ago, but she won a great election victory, huge election victory, 57%, I think, because people in Taiwan, I think, looked at the situation in Hong Kong and thought, well, you know, we don't want that. And so, I mean, I think this is kind of one of the things that's weird about the Xi era, that it has exposed. I mean, I think Reinhard is right. You know, the Xi Jinping era has clarified. It's clarified things that maybe were there, but now we can see them very, very clearly. You know, the pushback against liberalism, the pushback against rights lawyers, all of these issues. With Taiwan, I think that has been very sharp. You know, Taiwan has, I think, become even more of a problem for China, because you now don't really have, even with the KMT, you know, the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, you don't really have an easy way for them to appeal to this sort of emotional thing about reunification. It's kind of, they now also have to appeal to many of their supporters in saying that we need to preserve our autonomy. They're not talking about independence, but they're certainly talking about their autonomy. And so I think Taiwan has become deeply kind of symbolic of all of the contradictions of the People's Republic. The more powerful it becomes, in an odd way, the thing it most wants gets more out of its reach. And I think that someone recently wrote, you know, in a sense, it's acting almost as though it doesn't want to resolve the problem of Taiwan, because it's doing things in Hong Kong, which or things are happening in Hong Kong that I think people in Taiwan find really, really unappealing. And they do not, majority of Taiwanese, I think, don't think of one country, two systems as remotely valid and relevant for them.
Let me add just one hint, Fraser. We will be doing a webinar tonight with Harry Tseng, the Taiwan representative in Brussels, on the contribution from Taiwan to managing the COVID-19 crisis. I just want to highlight that if you want to join that conversation, you can go to my Twitter account and find the connection information.
Thanks, Reinhard. You mentioned BRI before, Reinhard, and there is a question about what will be the implications for Chinese ability to pursue this because of COVID-19, and secondly, the EU's connectivity strategy and possible links up with China in some areas. Do you think that still has any potential?
I would expect a new phase of scrutiny of the BRI inside China. Over the last years, between the first BRI summit and the second BRI summit, we already saw some criticism that China might be spending money that they might dearly need internally for internal development in splashing it out to recipients along the Belt and Road without effectively having the expected economic and political benefits. So as China will be more economically cash strapped and will find it harder to be offering such lavish contributions, there might be a revisiting, I would expect. And in practical terms, a lot of stuff is now basically shut down. As far as I know, China repatriated all the Chinese from Serbia, for instance, so they can't work on some of the projects because it's just they can't. The fact that they source most of their projects from Chinese sources, that they employ mostly Chinese companies, makes it now more difficult to realize the projects. So there would be, I would expect new difficulties there. As regards the European connectivity strategy, I already alluded to that. There, a lot depends on the MFF, the multi-annual financial framework. So far, connectivity is not even mentioned in the NDICI, the financing instrument that we have there for foreign policy. If that stays the same, I think it will be just another great European strategy that never materialized. But I would hope that the Geopolitical Commission understands that this could be one of their best tools. And as I said, the Japanese are interested, the Americans are interested, the Koreans are interested, Australia and India also.
Thank you. There's a question, maybe Kerry, you take this one up. There's a number of politicians in Europe and Australia, even in the United States, calling for compensation towards China for COVID-19. Is this likely to have any political legs?
Right. Well, I mean, I was actually thinking about that. I mean, China has its wolves, but we certainly also have jackals, you know, and I have to say that I don't know who's going to win with this one, because Reinhard mentioned Tom Turgon, the British MP, and the Henry Jackson Society has issued a report asking for reparations, I think of about 360 billion pounds. I believe a state in America is trying to get compensation from China. And, you know, obviously this scratches a kind of historic wound, because 120 years ago or more, you know, the kind of colonial powers, Britain included, of course, took fairly large reparations from the, you know, kind of Qing court. And so I kind of find this is going to be fairly sort of inflammatory for China, of course. And I think it's unrealistic. Of course, it's unrealistic. I mean, if there's going to be reparations, they will happen through economic cooperation, right? I mean, and that will be happening through new trade deals where we say, look, you know, this is a joint issue, and, you know, that would be a smart way of doing it, that China has an interest in us growing too, and therefore this is a chance for us to say we want more access to your markets for us to grow together. However, I think what we need to be alert to is the fact that there is a sort of lot of, you know, kind of blaming in all of this. There is the issue of the way that China created, or the way that China handled this problem at the beginning. And we've all taught about that and know about that, you know, kind of cover-ups and claims of, you know, sort of people being aware of this virus before it was publicly accepted. And, you know, all of that has been very, very widely commented on. But then also there is the issue, which is separate, of how different countries have reacted to the pandemic. It is true that this is a huge, huge kind of challenge for anyone, so no one was going to deal with this well. It is also true that, yes, it wasn't something that anyone wanted, for sure, but it's also not right to say that all governments can completely blame China for the problem. They have their own issues. In the UK, just to talk about the one that I know most, it seems to me quite sort of extraordinary that our foreign minister and current acting prime minister, because of course our prime minister has been very ill, so he hasn't been seen for a number of weeks, number of days. Dominic Raab, our foreign minister, said something last week about, we cannot carry on business as normal with China after this is over. Seeing as business with China for the UK before COVID-19 was limited investment, limited trade, limited contact, does that mean that after COVID, we're going to have more trade, more investment, and more contract? Because that wouldn't be business as normal. So I find this sort of rhetoric interesting, because it works in political dynamics within the UK. But I mean, it doesn't mean anything outside of the UK. It means nothing. Very finally, so this is a shared issue. It's an issue for China and the wolves there, and it's an issue for the jackals here in the UK, but in Europe. One of the curious things about the UK in particular, maybe not so much in Germany or Italy, but in the UK, we've never really had an emotion towards China. We've never really thought about it much. It's always been very remote. Now, we are really thinking about China, and British people have created an emotion. I believe the Henry Jackson Society, from some survey, I don't know what the methodology of this survey was, said that 77 or 78% of British people are now feeling angry towards China. So in a strange way, at least they're thinking about China now. I mean, it seems weird to say it, but at least they're thinking about China. They never did before. In another strange way, that is a kind of opportunity for China if it speaks to, you know, kind of this group and says, we actually, you know, matter in this, and, you know, we also acknowledge that there have been mistakes. You know, we kind of take a diplomatic tone of this is a global issue, it's a public health issue, we can work together, we've got scientists working with your scientists on finding a virus. This is an opportunity. So it is a great pity. I mean, for China, it's a pity. I think for us, it's a pity at the moment that, you know, the tone coming from China is sort of quite defensive and abrasive, and, you know, because I think actually having got people's attention, China could, in a weird way, use this to say, look, we're not completely bad. We're not bad at all, actually. You know, I mean, maybe there could be some sort of messaging, but at the moment, I don't see that happening. And I think that's a pity. I think that's a pity for everyone.
Can I come in here, Fraser?
Reinhard, let me just add another question for you. You can comment on that too. But before I do that, let me just remind people they can put their hands up if they want to ask questions. We're getting quite a lot of questions in on the chat box, but if you want to actually ask a question through audio, you're free to do so. So Reinhard, just adding to Kerry's answer there and relating to a question that's just come in about the prospects for cooperation between the EU and China on climate change, and going beyond that to embrace how we might better reorganize our societies to take into account sustainable development, you know, more localization of supply chains, a more green agenda, if you like. Is this an area where you see the EU and China being able to work together?
Well, that's a good question. Thank you for that. Let me first say I agree on the compensation issue. I think it's highly polemical. Which part of the cost inflicted do you attribute to the cover-up in China, and which part do you attribute to the insufficient management of your own government? And you have to pick your battles also, I would say. And we have been negotiating with the Chinese over a comprehensive agreement on investment for the last 7 years. We're not even close to finalizing that. It's highly improbable that this will be pulled off before the end of the year, as was foreseen. And if I would want to push back vis-a-vis China on economic issues, I would focus on the CAI, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, and try to convince them that they must make meaningful concessions to the Europeans. Second, the quote from Dominic Raab, I take that a bit differently. I see that in context with quotes from President Macron, quotes from the Chancellor Merkel, quotes from Vice President Biden, were all not very conservative Tories or extreme Republicans, and still also use language that pushes back and says, no, we cannot take what we cannot accept the approach that China is now choosing. I've heard from, I cannot quote this as a fact, but I've heard from sources in 3 different countries that Chinese interlocutors have made connections in conversations with Europeans and Americans between providing PPE on one hand and gaining access for Huawei in the 5G context. All of that has enraged so many people that I think there's really going to be a new approach. That's what I read in Dominic Raab's words. On climate, that should have been one of the main topics of the upcoming Leaders Summit in Leipzig in the middle of September between the EU 27 and Xi Jinping. The German side in particular, but also the EU institutions have pushed very hard to make headway there. To my knowledge, without any meaningful success. So the Europeans have pushed for a Chinese commitment to pledge peaking their CO2 emissions before 2030. You all will recall that 5 years ago in Paris, countries took national obligations, and then countries also agreed that they would improve their own contributions after 5 years. China has not been willing to move in that regard. Then the Europeans negotiated with China about a Chinese emissions trading system on CO2, which the Chinese have experimented with in, I think, 7 different regions of their country. And there was a pledge in the past that they would integrate that into a national system. That has been put off by Xi Jinping, and the Chinese are not willing to move on that. In addition to that, the Chinese are now pushing, in the context of Belt and Road, to build more than 200 additional coal-fired power plants along the Belt and Road. If only half of those would be built, Paris would go through the chimney. And in addition to that, in the next 5-year plan, there are discussions about adding another 150 gigawatt of coal-fired energy production in China. So in theory, I agree that the climate issue could be one area, one remit where we don't have so much of an antagonistic relationship, where we could see eye to eye and cooperate. And this has been Europe's approach, but I don't see that great willingness in China at the moment. I think China has been greener in the past than it is at the moment.
Thanks, Reinhard. Question to you, Kerry, from the United States. Will Britain rethink its Huawei decision?
Sorry. I'm on. Yeah. So the Huawei, the British approach to Huawei was always, we will do something, but we'll do it tomorrow. And it was always kind of strange to think, as a partner in the Five Eyes, intelligence sharing agreement, with the US, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, with all of the other security relationships we have with the United States, it would be quite difficult to stray far into working with other partners that the United States was not happy with. And so although last year, the Boris Johnson sort of government did say, well, we're going to kind of, sort of work with Huawei, it was always, we are going to, it was never, we're going to be we are doing a huge amount with them. I think Huawei saw the United Kingdom as a more benign environment. It did have it does have, kind of a center here where technologists look at the different kind of coding and stuff, and the sort of possibilities of security breaches. But I mean, that's the sort of technical side. The political side is much tougher. I would be very surprised, in view of the current situation, if the UK were to do anything with Huawei in the future, because the United States has clearly taken a strong view on this and has pretty much blocked Huawei from the US, and is being insistent that its security alliances follow it on this. So I think we may say we'll do stuff, but I don't think we can and would probably do anything with Huawei, and I can't see that changing, particularly after what's happened, with this issue.
And in Germany, why not?
Well, in Germany, we have a very peculiar situation because the debate about a possible inclusion of Huawei in the building of a 5G network has been the first case that I am aware of where the national security community battled the free traders to a draw. In recent history in Germany, being as dependent on foreign trade as we are, it would not have been an issue that the prevalent orientation would have been to foster trade, to allow to adhere to free trade and a free trade agenda. And in this case, there has been a rebellion, a widely shared rebellion from different ministries, from within Merkel's CDU party. My party is opposed, the Liberals are opposed. And the Chancellor has tried to kick the can down the alley a little bit in a similar way as has just been described for the British government. I would expect that the German Parliament will insist on legislation that says that high-risk providers have to be dealt with in a way that would not explicitly say we shun Huawei, but would have the effect of shunning Huawei. And we have an example that we can look at for practical purposes, which is the strategy that was chosen in Australia, where the legislation does not even mention China or Huawei, but clearly makes sure that they will not be in the mold.
We have a question, perhaps just time for two more, I think. Maybe to Kerry, we have a question from a Chinese participant. China admitted that it made mistakes, and then it provided substantial medical assistance, sending experts and supplies to Europe. Why has Europe been so slow to appreciate this?
So, well, I think that the help and assistance that's been given has been appreciated. I mean, in Italy and elsewhere, I think people have been appreciative. I guess that the problem is that the perception in Europe often is, you know, who's the audience for this? I mean, we're Europeans, right? We don't like propaganda, you know. So I suppose it seems to me, just looking at, you know, the aid that's arrived in Britain, that the aid is obviously very welcome. You know, we've had problems with supply of, you know, masks and whatever, you know, and kind of various technical equipment in Britain. But I guess it seems that there's a very big difference between the way in which this news is played in Europe and the way that it's played in China. And in seeing the way that it's played in China, it seems to sort of fit a narrative where, you know, it's pretty political. I mean, it seems to me it's very, very political. It's like Europe, you know, is now a sort of supplicant. And I mean, you know, we don't really like to think of ourselves as supplicants. We think that we're all helping each other. And I think China doesn't want to think it's a supplicant, you know, and so we shouldn't really have that feeling. So I guess if I was in Beijing and I was sort of in the, you know, kind of publicity or the propaganda department, I'd be kind of thinking, okay, we're doing a thing that we think is sincere and right, but obviously the message is not quite right for Europe. We need to rethink a bit how we get that message across if that's what we're trying to do, because it seems to have created a lot of controversy in some European places. But I mean, I just underline the assistance is very welcome, of course. I guess it's just the way that it is sort of relayed in some news outlets.
And the final question.
I would remind everybody that, for instance, President von der Leyen publicly thanked China for support, as did others. China had a great opportunity of winning a lot of goodwill if they had chosen an approach similar to the one that Taiwan has taken, which was doing what is right and being low-key about propaganda. But China insisted on being thanked publicly, and they just blew the appreciation. And to some degree, some of the stories that developed also clearly hurt. So for instance, when Vučić, the president of Serbia, thanked his friend and brother Xi Jinping and kissed the Chinese flag, welcoming PPE from China, what was not communicated was that he paid for the PPE from China, that he bought from China with money from the European Union, and that the European Union even paid for the transport from China to Serbia. And China, sort of taking advantage of that, just blew what it could have successfully promoted.
This relates to the final question, Reinhard. There was evidently a EU report coming out this week on disinformation from China and Russia. Do you think there's any cooperation between Beijing and Moscow on disinformation tactics?
I don't think so, but I think the Chinese, unfortunately, are learning from Putin.
Okay. Any final remarks anybody wishes to make before we close?
Well,
Kerry?
no, I mean, I think it's important. Reinhard and I obviously agree on some things, disagree on others, but I think it is important that politicians and academics, have a civil discourse, and I think we've just proved that. It's been great to talk to Reinhard again. We met in Beijing about 18 months ago, and it was a great learning occasion then for me. So I feel today, I've learned a great deal from listening to Reinhard, and also I think it's important for us at this very difficult time to show that we can share different perspectives, but not in an uncivil way. So I think we can give ourselves a little pat on the back there.
And that was going to be my.
And I would just add that, as I said in the beginning, I'm not neutral, and sometimes I get into a fit. But
Okay.
bottom line is, I do value arguments.
That's what the centre is trying to do, to bring academics, politicians and officials together. So thank you, gentlemen, very much. Thank you everyone who's online watching. I think you'll agree it's been a really excellent debate, and we'll inform you of our next one very soon. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you very much.
Stay safe.
Have a good day.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay.